The first technique that we are going to talk about is called wet on wet. So in order to start this technique, we are going to have to activate our paint with a few sprays of water, as well as spraying our paper a few times. This makes our paper wet, which means we are starting with a wet paper and adding wet paint to it. Notice how the paint bleeds and spreads around? That is what the wet on wet watercolor technique does. The next technique we are going to talk about is called the salt technique. So the first thing we do is we get our paper wet with a watercolor wash, which means I'm just painting wet paint onto my paper. Then I take just a little bit of salt and I sprinkle it on my paper while my paper's still wet, and then you have to leave it alone and let it sit. We will look back at the salt paper once it's sat for a little bit, but for now we're going to talk about a Crayon Resist technique, which means I'm going to be using regular crayons that are made out of wax to draw on my paper, and then I'm going to paint over top of them. So I start with any colors of crayons and I make a really waxy or a dark line on my paper. I decided to use green and I decided to use white because white's kind of like a hidden message. Then I paint a watercolor wash over top and you can see exactly where my crayon was. The next technique we're going to learn about uses the watercolor pencils instead of the watercolor palette. I begin by choosing a color to draw on my paper, and I make sure that I draw using a lot of lead because I want it to turn into a lot of paint. So after I get my color drawn down onto my paper, I use a wet paintbrush and I smear the watercolor pencil all over my paper. Then I use a fingernail file and I file one of the other colors of watercolor pencil over top to give it a speckled look. For this next technique, we'll be using a paper towel and a piece of tape. Before I stick my tape to my paper, I stick it to my shirt first so that it's not too sticky and it won't tear the paper when we try to take it off. So after I've stuck it to my shirt, then I stick it on my paper where I want my paper to stay white. This is called tape resist. So after I get my tape stuck down, I use my paintbrush to make a watercolor wash over top of my paper, and then I use the paper towel to blot it, and it kind of gives a textured look. The last technique that we are going to talk about is called dry brush. So for this technique, you are going to need a dry paintbrush. Your paint should already be wet from when we activated it earlier, but when you mix a dry paintbrush with wet paint, it's a little bit stickier and your paintbrush lines aren't quite as smooth. You should be able to tell the difference. Okay, it's time to look back at our tape resist and our salt techniques. You can tell where I take the tape off, the paper is completely white, so it did a great job of resisting the paint. You can also see where the salt dried on my paper and absorbed some of the paint to leave a crystallized effect. I hope that you guys have a great time trying out these techniques.